Hello, I'm Devin Bates, and today we're going to do a comparison of the Mark VII Apex 10 with a Mark VII auto drive and the Dillon RL1100 with a Mark VII auto drive. I'm lucky enough to have one of each. I had a buddy of mine who decided to get out of reloading, and so I ended up with a bunch of equipment, and he had a Mark VII auto drive that he hadn't hooked up, so I hooked it up to the 1100, and now I've spent a little time working with both, and I think now is a good time to go over pros and cons and what I think. So anyway, let's dive in. Okay, let's start with the RL1100 with the Mark VII auto drive. This is what it looks like. Does my heart good to see this thing humming along 2,000 rounds a minute, but let's go ahead and shut it down. So we'll go through each station on the RL1100 and how it works with the auto drive and the different sensors that are available. So of course we start with the first station. This is where we deprime the case. I have these FW Arms decapper and then a hold down die. I've talked about these in some of my other videos and I absolutely love them. Just a reminder, I am not sponsored by anybody, so if I tell you I like something, it's because I like it, and if I tell you I don't like something, it's because I don't like it. So let's get to the first I don't like. So one of the sensors that is available in the Mark VII system is called Decap Sense. Looks like this, and it would fit under here, and it's got an electronic eye in there that looks for a primer falling by it. If it doesn't see a primer falling through there, then it will stop the machine. Well, that sounds pretty handy. The only problem is that sensor gets dirty, especially with range brass, and over time, the sensor keeps giving you false readings. You clean it, and you do that so often that you get tired of it. And then finally, after about 8,000 rounds, you just can't clean it well enough. So save your money on that one. You can see this little piece right here is what allows me to add a tube down to something to catch primers, because once you start with automation, the primer cup that comes with the RL1100 is going to fill up way too quick. So you need a different solution. The item that's here is just 3D printed. So if you have a friend that's got a 3D printer or you have one, then you can find these on the internet. I'll see if I can find a link, and if so, I'll put it in the description. There's already a screw on the press, so you're ready to go. Next station is where we swage the case. And so you'll see down here, there's a swage rod that will go up, and especially important on 223 brass or something that might have a military crimp. I have this press set up currently to process 45 ACP brass, so not a big deal on this, and that's also why there's not a whole lot going on the tool head. But anyway, enough of that. My favorite sensor is Swage Sense, and it will go in this section. It will replace this swage rod here. Now, something I learned, again, I mentioned that I purchased this stuff from a buddy of mine. He probably bought this sensor thinking he was going to put it on a Super 1050 instead of an RL1100. You have to be careful there because the sensors are different. The mechanism here for the swaging is different on those two machines, so be sure you get the right one. I'm going to have to order a other one. So the thing I like about this is it's looking for the pressure when you're swaging this case, and if it's higher than a certain level, it will stop. What causes it to have too much pressure? Well, there's still a primer in the case, is one case, or possibly a ringer. So I think this is a much better system to find a primer that didn't eject properly than the primer sense that would go here. Also, you need this sensor because if there's still a primer in there or a ringer, when you get here to prime the case, bad things happen. So you want to make sure that that's gone. This RL1100 has 8 stations. You have these 3 on this side, and then there are, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4 more on this side. The station here where you're priming, this on the tool head is not threaded, which I don't really care for. I wish they gave you a way to have a hold down die or something there. But that's one of my issues. But you prime here, you just have the standard Dillon priming system. You can get a sensor, and I would recommend it, that goes on top of the primer tube. It's really inexpensive, like $35 or something, but it just has a wire that goes down to your control box back there that will let the press know when you're out of primers, and it will stop it so you don't start dumping powder all over the place. So your next station is typically where you do a powder drop, and in the Dillon system, that's also where the neck of the case is expanded. And then the next station that you're going to use when you're automated is for a Mr. Bullet feeder. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to be setting your bullets in each case with automation. You're just defeating the purpose. Next station is where we seat the bullet to depth. And then finally, last station is where we will crimp it. So one of the other sensors that I don't have installed currently on this machine, we'll see it when we look at the Apex 10, is a bullet sensor. So it makes sure, and it's looking at this station where you go to seat the bullet into the case. It will have a laser, and we'll see this in a minute, that if the bullet is not oriented properly, it will stop the press, and that'll really save you a bunch of hassle as well. Last thing we want is to have that bullet off to the side and crushes it and just causes all kinds of grief. So one of the issues, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is with the number of stations that we have on this tool head, there's no way when we have a Mr. Bullet feeder to have a powder level check as well. So we don't know if we double charged or single charged or no charge our case. And when you're going fast, there's no way to know what's going on at every station. It's just things are moving way too fast. So a couple of things about this system. The shell plate on the RL1100 operates great. I never have any issues with this, and we'll talk about that on the Apex 10. Also, the case feeder on the RL1100, I prefer to the case feeder on the Apex 10. It just does a nice job. It's been around forever. Just works great. Doesn't have any trouble keeping up with the speed of the machine. So it really does a nice job. So RL1100 has been around for a long time. The 1050 was really the precursor to the RL1100. I've had a 1050 for years, so I've had a lot of experience with this loader, and they do a great job. And I highly recommend the automation. It will make your life a whole lot easier. So at this point, let's switch gears and we'll go over to the Mark VII Apex 10 and talk about that machine. Here is the Mark VII Apex 10, just so you know that it goes up and down as well. Again, my shoulder thanks me every time I see one of these things, because I'm not having to pull the handle each time. One thing I didn't mention a minute ago is the control system for both the Apex 10 and the RL1100 are exactly the same. These auto drives are really the same auto drive except for a little different linkage on how it hooks into the machine. So anyway, let's dig in here on the Apex 10 and move around each station like we did before. I'm setting this machine up to load some 9mm, so there's a little bit more going on up here on the tool head, but again, that doesn't really matter. Either of these can load or process brass, so we'll get moving. So first station again is for decapping, so there's a hole underneath here. There's a little tube that you would hook up your plastic tube to take care of the primers and get those going down here. But since I've already processed the brass, I won't be decapping it here. Before I start loading, I'll throw a decapper in there just in case one of them got missed. So the next station again is swaging, just like the RL1100. But here you can see I have the swage sense sensor installed, and again, this is one of my favorite sensors. It lets me know if I have a ringer or had a case where the primer didn't fall out. So I really do like this swage sense. These FW arms hold down dies do a great job. You can see that they, maybe you can see, they have a guide that goes around the case. That's extremely important and very handy when you are loading a bottleneck case like 223. Helps orient it just right. Next station here is where we prime the case. You can see I have another hold down die sitting here, and that is to just put a little pressure on the case so that as we're pushing up with the primer, the case is being pushed down. I just find I get a little better seat on that. You can see here that I'm using just the standard Apex 10 priming system. I'm not using the Primer Express that would go off back here that shakes and is supposed to, automatically put primers. You put, 100 in there or 300 at a time. I had one of those and I just never got it to where it would adjust right. And so I went back to this regular tube. This is the sensor that lets the press know when you're out of primers, so it'll stop so you don't make a mess when they hit the powder deal. I have it set up where I can just pull this sensor off, and then I have a Dillon primer loader. Just come over here, pop that baby in, dump your 100 primers, and you're going again. The nice thing about this system is, of course, this primer loader will work for both machines. And on top of that, it's $150, $200 cheaper than the Primer Express. So in my case, that one was a waste of money. So your mileage may vary. The next station we come to right here is where we're going to expand the neck of the case. On the Dillon press, the powder drop expands the neck on the case, but on this press, they are two separate stations. So while this is a 10-station press and the Dillon is an 8-station press, you're really just picking up one extra station at the end of the day. But this sensor right here I really like. This is the primer orientation sensor. So it lets you know if you have no primer or an upside down primer, or there's an issue where the primer's not fully seated. You can see I've had some upside down primers, and so I keep some of these so I can test that sensor, and it works well. Sometimes it gets a little dirty and you have to clean it, and can be a little finicky at times, but it's worth the effort. The next station is where we load powder. The Apex 10 comes with a manual powder drop. I have chosen to do their electronic powder drop. I find when I'm going fast, I believe it's a little more accurate and don't have any issues with it. The other powder system works fine. I just like this one, but you better. It's kind of expensive. I don't remember, maybe like $600 or something. The next sensor here that you can see is the powder sensor. And this one I really like because, again, it lets me know if I had no charge, a good charge, or a double charge. And when you're moving fast, there's no way you can look at that and keep up with it. So that sensor is not available on the RL1100 when you're running automated because you have to have Mr. Bullet Feeder, which is the next sensor, or actually not sensor, but station in this setup. And it drops your bullet. And if it does a good job, this sensor, which is the bullet orientation sensor, will let it move on. Here is where it uses a laser that bounces off that mirror in the back. And as long as a bullet is in there and it has the shadow of that bullet, everything's fine. But if the bullet is, off upside down or off of the case, in other words, just not even there, or even sideways, it'll stop the press, which saves you from getting a whole lot of gunpowder here in your bin where your completed cartridges come out. And then finally, the last station is where we crimp it. We'll seat it here and crimp it. And at that point, we'll have a loaded round. So some of the things I like about this press are the number of sensors that you have. Again, when you're moving fast, it's really impossible to keep up with everything. So having a sensor really at kind of every point in the process really works well. Again, I would skip the primer drop sensor here because I don't think it works very well, but all of the other sensors I think are a good plan. So what do I not like about this press? I really don't like the pawl system that they use to advance the shell plate. It is constantly getting out of adjustment. There's a set screw back in the back, hard to find, hard to get to. You really just kind of have to feel it, that you're having to adjust a lot so that the shell plate lines up with each station. And it is a real pain and doesn't work very well. The new setup that the Apex 10 is moving to has a separate motor for the shell plate versus the tool head. And so I think they realized this wasn't a good system and have fixed that by just completely eliminating it. Another thing I don't like as much is the case feeder. This case feeder tends to bind up. The case plate that's in here will get a case stuck in it and it will bind up. Now, one thing that's handy is you have a button here that will allow you to reverse the direction, but oftentimes that's not enough to clear the case. So this case feeder requires you to just add a few cases at a time so that you don't get as many bind ups. And so I really don't like that as much. The Mr. Bullet Feeder also attaches to your case feeder. It normally has this spacer, which moves it this way a little bit. And that gets the bottom of the Mr. Bullet Feeder here in contact with your powder reservoir, which really doesn't work well. So I removed that spacer and that's better. But I wish there was a way on this mount to be able to rotate the Mr. Bullet feeder just a little bit. I think it would work much better, and you wouldn't have the bullet spring getting in the way of the powder drop. So the last thing, and this is in the total nitpicky category, is this is the controller for the electronic powder drop. And why in the world do you put the plug and a switch on the front of the box? But anyway, like I said, completely nitpicky. But so that is a rundown on the Apex 10 with the Mark 7 auto drive. And at this point, I'm going to switch gears and go through just a quick comparison and let you know what I think and what you might want to consider if you're looking at both of these. So now for some final thoughts. Both of these systems work great, and I would say if you have a Dillon 1050 or an RL1100 already, I would just go ahead and get the Mark 7 auto drive, and I think you'll be quite happy. If I'm starting from scratch and I don't have either of these presses, then I would go with the Apex 10 with the Mark 7 auto drive. The Apex 10 was designed from the get-go to be automated, and that's why it has the ability to have all of the sensors necessary, or at least preferred, when you're reloading or processing brass at speed. The RL1100 would be great for just processing brass, as you don't need some of the sensors that you really can't put on that machine. And in fact, that's what I'm likely to use it for. People go, well, why don't you just buy a CP2000, which is Dillon's brass processing press? And for me, two reasons. Number one, I already have an RL1100. And number two, if I want to load something on that press, I can, where the CP2000 is simply case prep and really not much difference in price. So I'm not sure I understand that product. Speaking of price, I did a quick look on the internet. So how much money are you looking at if you're starting from scratch? Well, if you're starting from scratch in the Dillon world, and this is to get the press and the auto drive and the sensors that are available for it, minus the one I don't like, the primer sensor, you're looking at about $5,800. And that is before any dyes or powder or primers or anything else. So you need to be ready to load quite a bit of ammunition for this to make sense for you. If you're starting from scratch on the Apex 10, when you look at that press with all of the sensors that it can have, you're looking at about $6,400, which is about $600 more, but bear in mind there are a couple of sensors in the Apex 10 number that you just can't do on the RL1100. Seemingly the presses are only about a couple of $100 difference, with the Apex 10 being a little bit more expensive, and the number of sensors that you can have is just greater on the Apex 10. And then finally, so what is a caliber change going to cost you? And when I looked at that, it was really just $60 difference between the two, and I'm including a tool head on that, because once you set one up, it's sure nice to just be able to pull it off and put on another tool head and make slight adjustments when you need to, but not start from scratch. So from a convenience standpoint, it's worth it, at least for calibers that you load a bunch. So at the end of the day, again, if you already have Dillon equipment, you're used to Dillon equipment, then go ahead and add the auto drive, and I think you're going to be happy. But if you're starting from scratch, my recommendation is the Apex 10. So anyway, I hope this helped, and happy reloading.